He had to stay in therapy for a good while to deal with the mental scars and the stress of being under the microscope for so long. Even though the paperwork says suicide, there's always been this lingering feeling that the whole story never really came out. Her loved ones will always believe that the cult-like grip of that community is what really killed her. Tyler, for his part, managed to walk away with a mere slap on the wrist, facing only exile from the flock and a tattered reputation. This entire ordeal really highlights the sheer destructiveness of high control groups that operate with such rigid authority. It is proof that psychological games, cutting ties with the outside world, and blind loyalty can end in absolute disaster. If you found this investigation interesting, please go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more. We drop fresh true crime content here for you every single night. Till we meet again, keep your wits about you and stay safe. They looked like the perfect pair, a young bride and her charismatic groom whose romance started with campus run-ins and shared devotion. Yet under that polished surface, they buried dark secrets that no one ever dared to speak about out loud. Inside their private clique, strange mandates, wild prophecies, and odd rituals took root, blurring the lines of personal space. Then suddenly the whole thing fell apart, leaving behind nothing but unanswered questions. This is the tale of how belief in authority got twisted up with a dangerous obsession for control. And what happens when reality gets warped by one man's delusions. Bethany Deaton grew up deep in the heart of Texas as one of 5 kids in a big Christian household. Her folks stuck to old school values and tried their best from the get-go to ground their kids in faith and a heavy sense of obligation to the Lord. Growing up in that nurturing yet strict moral bubble really molded who Bethany became. Quiet, intense, and kept to herself. Even as a little girl, Bethany showed she was sharp as a tack. She always had her nose in a book, preferring to get lost in stories instead of doing the usual kid stuff with friends. By the time she hit 13, she'd plowed through almost everything Dickens ever wrote. She could break down his novels with a level of insight you rarely see even in grown-ups. That passion for reading came with a knack for writing, too. Bethany loved crafting her own stories and felt a deep need to put her thoughts on paper early on. As she got older, that hobby turned into a serious daily habit. She maintained a personal blog, uploading entries that were surprisingly sophisticated and packed with raw emotion. Those posts, blending gravity, wit, and musings on God, showed just how deep her inner world really was. By her early 20s, Bethany had racked up close to 200 pages of material. It proved she had talent, but also a burning drive to figure out the deeper meaning of life. Bethany fantasized about becoming a college professor while penning her own novels on the side. Yet, her dreams weren't just about climbing the career ladder. Since her teen years, she pictured a quiet, peaceful life in a house surrounded by trees with a husband and kids nearby. Her wish for a happy marriage was fueled by a private habit. She prayed all the time for her future husband and even drafted letters to the man she hadn't met yet. Those notes were a testament of hope, proof she trusted God to eventually send the guy who'd share her spiritual path and personal dreams. Tyler Deaton came into the world in 1985, born to very devout parents. From the start, he showed off not just a gift for music, but a serious fascination with all things spiritual. His creative streak and need for attention mixed with a fixation on fantasy realms and doomsday scenarios. He pulled ideas from Narnia, Harry Potter, and Scripture that focused on prophecies and the apocalypse. Eventually, those themes got tangled up with his own ego, convincing him he was picked for a higher calling. In 2005, Tyler started at Southwestern University in Georgetown, Texas, a place famous for tough academics and deep religious roots. That's where his persona really started to solidify. His magnetic charm and knack for preaching about faith made him stand out from the crowd. He joined in on worship band sessions and intense theological debates, yet he constantly bashed the school prayer circles, arguing they were shallow and lacked real spiritual guts. Tyler's path shifted gears big time when he ran into Bethany at Southwestern. She was hooked by his vibe, his focus, and how he could fire up anyone's imagination. For Bethany, raised in the church and hungry for a more profound connection to God, Tyler's message really resonated. She started showing up at his meetups, and eventually she started seeing him as her spiritual mentor. In the summer of 2007, Tyler claimed he had a vision. On July 21st, while waiting in a queue for the new Harry Potter book, he said he got a direct order from above, a charge to shift the spiritual vibe of the whole college. He was convinced he was picked to build a prayer team that could reshape the future, not just for the school, but for the whole world. Bethany was one of the chosen few. Following that, Tyler started building a cult of personality. He made heavy comparisons between his crusade and the fantasy novels he loved. Narnia taught him that regular folks could become soldiers in the war between light and dark. To him, Harry Potter represented the never-ending fight against the shadows. Reading Rick Joyner's The Final Quest solidified his idea that he was an end-times prophet. Bethany was one of the rare souls who bought into it completely. She was attracted not just to his charm, but to how he wove pop culture stories into heavy spiritual lessons. Joining Tyler's inner circle felt like the logical next move for her faith and her life's mission. In fact, it seemed like proof positive that she had finally found her true calling. In 2009, after wrapping up at Southwestern, Tyler and his tight squad made a big choice. Rather than splitting up to chase their own careers, they decided to move to Kansas City as a unit, and Bethany tagged along for the ride. She was totally on board with Tyler's plan, viewing the relocation as the ultimate fulfillment of her spiritual destiny. The whole reason for the move was to dive headfirst into something called the One Thing Internship. This program was run by the International House of Prayer, or IHOP, an organization started by Pastor Mike Bickle that is famous for its nonstop prayer meetings and heavy focus on the end times. For Tyler, this wasn't just another gig to add to his resume. It was the green light he needed, a chance to use the organization as a springboard to launch his very own spiritual empire. Out of that ambition, a tight-knit circle was born, referring to themselves simply as the community. They set up shop in a quiet suburb just outside the city called Grandview, strictly dividing the living arrangements by gender. Bethany was bunked in the women's house, where she and the other ladies had to toe the line on a strict set of regulations. Tyler micromanaged practically every second of their existence, dictating everything from when they prayed to how they ran the household. It didn't take long to realize that thinking for yourself was a big no-no, and stepping out of line was treated as straight-up rebellion. One of the first big bombs Tyler dropped was the order to sever ties with their families. He claimed that blood relatives were basically spiritual dead weight that would drag down the group's holy mission. Consequently, a lot of the members ghosted their loved ones, sometimes going dark for months or even years. Bethany, who had always been super close with her folks, found herself trapped in this bubble of isolation, slowly drifting away from the very people she used to lean on. Tyler also insisted that everyone toss their professional goals in the trash. People who had spent years dreaming of becoming scientists, doctors, or artists were told to walk away from those futures completely. Instead, they ended up working menial gigs in retail or food service, dumping every cent of their paychecks into a communal pot that Tyler controlled. He figured he was above the daily grind, claiming his full-time job was just being the spiritual boss. To keep his grip tight, Tyler rolled out something he called marriage prophecies. He insisted that the Almighty was whispering in his ear, telling him exactly who was supposed to hook up with whom. He was the ultimate matchmaker and breakup artist, stripping away any shred of privacy regarding their personal lives. Every single romance was subject to his approval and interpretation of God's will, and Bethany was right in the thick of it. Her own dreams of walking down the aisle were pushed aside by Tyler's decrees, which he dressed up as holy guidance instead of manipulation. A chilling example of how tight a leash they were on happened with Bo Harrington, who got branded a rebel in the fall of 2010 and thrown into isolation. For 8 long months, he was stuck in the men's quarters, totally cut off from speaking to another soul. He didn't see the light of day until the spring of 2011, and that was only because the bigwigs at the International House of Prayer caught wind of what was going down. They basically told the group to let him back into the fold and treat him like a human being again. By that point, the community had morphed into a sealed-off ecosystem with a brutal pecking order. On paper, they were still under the IHOP umbrella, but in reality, they were a rogue unit operating entirely under Tyler's thumb. As the group dug its heels deeper into Kansas City, Tyler Deaton's life turned into a tangled mess of lies and contradictions. To the outside world, he played the part of the wise spiritual mentor, preaching about morals and discipline. But behind closed doors, things were way messier, filled with weird rituals and secret intimacies. His bond with Bethany was heavy and loaded with symbolism, yet completely lacking in any physical affection. Even though they looked like a couple and showed small signs of caring, their relationship was strictly hands-off. Instead of going out for dinner and a movie, they would bake bread together, treating it like some holy act. It was supposed to represent their unity and readiness for marriage, but there was zero touching and absolutely no romantic payoff. For Bethany, living like this was an agonizing emotional roller coaster. Her hopes for a real, loving partnership were constantly crushed by Tyler's insistence on symbolic gestures, while a whole other reality was being hidden from view. Tyler was actually hooking up with several of the guys inside his own group. This little secret was kept under lock and key, known only to a tiny inner circle of his most loyal followers. Out in the open, Tyler was screaming from the pulpit against same-sex relationships, calling them a major sin. The gap between his public bastion of sin and what he was doing in the dark was massive and deeply disturbing. Within the cult, they engaged in what Tyler dubbed group embraces. He spun these cuddle sessions as a way to bond spiritually, claiming that long periods of physical contact would help them unlock supernatural harmony. In reality, though, those meetings made the separation between feelings and physical touch incredibly hazy. Tyler frequently used those moments as a weapon to demand total obedience and manufacture reliance, so those alleged rituals actually hit two targets at once. They cemented his power under the guise of holy training, while letting him chase his own cravings without having to answer to anyone in public. The folks in the inner circle, completely under the spell of Tyler's doctrine, just took these actions as a standard part of their duties. Hardly anyone ever stopped to ask why he did it, and Bethany remained totally sure that they were fated to walk down the aisle. She truly thought the reason they never got physical was strictly because of the holy calling they were both committed to following. Being high up on the totem pole just made that idea stick, helping her excuse Tyler's actions as some kind of noble sacrifice for the greater good. But when you looked at it from Tyler's side, the whole connection was basically just for show. It served as a prop to harden his reputation as the man in charge instead of being any real sign that he cared about her. The guy was living two totally different lives, preaching about staying pure on stage while secretly hooking up with guys and running fake spiritual ceremonies behind closed doors. That two-faced behavior built a culture where the rules didn't apply to him and made the group need him even more, robbing them of the sense to ask what was actually going on. Back in February of 2012, Tyler finally popped the question to Bethany. He spun the proposal as the completion of a promise he made ages ago and the direct result of some serious praying. To Bethany, that moment was the specific sign she had been holding out for all this time. Inside their little bubble, getting engaged wasn't viewed as a happy personal step, but rather as a piece of their group's destiny. Getting ready for the big day turned into a team assignment that Tyler micromanaged, making almost every call while barely letting the families have a say. They marked the calendar for August 18th, 2012, and planned an event that felt heavy on the religious vibes. Everything centered around praying and holy unions in their joint work. So even though Bethy's folks showed up, a lot of them felt like they didn't belong. People saw that Tyler kept his henchmen close by, and the whole service felt way more like a mandatory meeting than a joyful party. A bunch of Bethy's tightest friends later confessed that they didn't feel a single ounce of happiness on that afternoon. One person even admitted they had a sick feeling in their stomach, and despite how chill it looked, plenty of guests walked away feeling seriously creeped out. They were basically just an audience for the show, while Bethany did her absolute best to keep a straight face through it all. She had convinced herself that tying the knot would fix the stress she felt and finally give her that domestic life she always fantasized about. Tyler, on the other hand, stayed cold and stiff, dodging any kind of loving touch, even on their big day, by saying he needed to keep his mind on God. The majority of the people watching and running the show were actually just members from inside the group. Bethy's kin got pushed to the back, while the vows harped on duty and missions without any real heartfelt promises of love. Tyler refused to tell anyone where they were going for the honeymoon until they were literally about to board the plane. Bethany didn't actually find out they were flying down to Costa Rica until they showed up at the terminal with bags in hand. Things felt pretty standard in the beginning as they unpacked their stuff, mapped out tours, and chatted about what lay ahead for them. However, whenever Bethany attempted to snuggle up to her new husband, he shut her down hard, ending any hugs or kisses with pure annoyance. Tyler argued that getting too touchy-feely pulled his attention away from his divine mission and messed with his spiritual antenna. They never even consummated the marriage that night. which totally floored Bethany, leading her to beg for some kind of reason why. She went so far as to propose. They dropped the holy talk for a bit, just so they could actually enjoy each other's company. All she got in return were fuzzy replies, quick pivots to other topics, and a massive wall of emotional ice. Since she was left by herself for hours on end, she ended up burying her nose in those vampire romance novels. Reading was the only way she could run away from her rising panic, killing time while her talks with Tyler dwindled down to boring chore lists. To the outside world, things looked fine, complete with vacation snapshots, fun travel anecdotes, and those practiced polite grins. Deep down, though, the trip left a massive hole in her heart because she came back without any intimacy or a valid reason for being pushed away. The union that was supposed to kickstart a fresh chapter actually launched by denying the most private part of being a couple. That moment signaled the start of a shift so big that nobody could pretend it wasn't happening anymore. Once they got back home, the relationship never really found its foot. Before long, she started clocking way more hours over at the communal house for the ladies, sometimes crashing there for days at a time. The girls she lived with saw how jittery and down she was, but when they asked, she just dodged it by claiming she needed room to breathe. Insomnia at night and total exhaustion during the day turned into the new normal for her. Evenings with Tyler were pretty rare, and even when they did happen, she didn't find any comfort in them at all. Bethany kept shifting in bed, denying him sleep and driving his irritation through the roof. By daylight, she retreated further into a shell of indifference, dodging chats and shutting down any talk of what lay ahead. People nearby began sensing the mounting pressure bubbling beneath the surface. The situation reached a boiling point on October 23, 2012. Tyler walked into the kitchen to discover Bethany clutching a cup brimming with windshield wiper fluid. Snatching the cup from her hands, he immediately dialed 911 for help. Upon the police's arrival, Bethany confessed that death felt simpler than trying to fix herself. Authorities took her into protective custody for a mental health assessment and rushed her to Truman Medical Center. She told the hospital staff that Tyler's doctrines had convinced her she was spiritually damned with zero hope for redemption. These convictions had driven her directly toward ideas of self-destruction. When questioned about potential future attempts, she admitted she would likely try again. She flatly rejected all pharmaceutical aid, turning down even basic antidepressants. Ignoring the glaring red flags, the facility released Bethany just 48 hours later on October 25th. Tyler argued that letting her out this early was dangerous, yet his protests fell on deaf ears. Once she was back on the outside, Bethany's mental state deteriorated rapidly. Insomnia plagued her more than ever, cycling between intense panic attacks and total emotional numbness. She constantly talked about her soul being fractured and how she was marching toward inevitable ruin. Long talks with friends became a thing of the past, as she gave short answers and begged them to stop prying. Whenever someone brought up jobs, artistic endeavors, or relatives, she simply wouldn't say a word. She started retreating to the women's residence more often, insisting she required solitude and quiet. The whole scenario looked bleak, marked by a rapid downward spiral involving seclusion, insomnia, rejected medical help, and persistent threats of self-harm. Bethany labeled her state as spiritual doom, convinced she was locked into a destiny that could never be altered. Toward the close of October, she looked physically exhausted, and nobody in her circle could see a way for her to get better. This descent into darkness showed no signs of stopping. Following Bethany's release from the ward, Tyler laid down a fresh mandate for the community. Everyone was banned from contacting her or extending a helping hand. He claimed that providing comfort only fed into her ego. The community took his phrasing not as a suggestion, but as an absolute order. Consequently, talking to Bethany pretty much stopped altogether. Her cries for notice were ignored, and any necessary exchanges turned cold and strictly business. On October 29th, 2012, Tyler held another gathering to preach about the need to abandon self-interest to serve the greater cause. He spoke with a harsh, practically blaming inflection. Even without dropping Bethany's name, the subtext was unmistakable. She remained seated on the periphery, quiet, avoiding any part in the conversation. The complete radio silence directed at her after that session only solidified her alienation. On the following morning, October 30th, Bethany stopped by the women's residence. Dropping off a few personal items, she bade farewell and When quizzed about her job or what was next, just said, "I don't know." She walked out moments later and never came back. All day long, she was a ghost at the men's quarters and absent from her standard hangouts. Her phone remained silent, sending no messages and making no calls. People realized she was missing by that night, yet nobody sounded the alarm. Since Tyler had emphasized she had to journey solo, that marked the final sighting by the group. The subsequent events would only come to light via police documentation. Deep into the night of October 30th, dispatch at the Jackson County Sheriff's Office got a tip about a strange car. The automobile was sitting stationary at the Longview Lake recreation area. A witness stated that a tan minivan had been idling for a long time in a dark, secluded corner of the parking lot right against the woods. Deputies pulled up at approximately 9:40 p.m. and verified the plates belonged to Bethany Deaton. The doors were secured from within, and the glass was sealed tight. No external dents or scratches could be seen. Peering inside, deputies spotted a figure in the rear. Once they broke in, they found Bethany Deaton's lifeless body lying across the third row. Her head was encased in a white plastic sack, knotted tight at the throat. Next to her on the floorboard lay 2 containers of Tylenol PM, one drained and the other sealed. Resting on the cushion directly ahead of her was a scrawled letter. The van's interior looked undisturbed. Bethany's things were organized tidily on the front seat. Investigators found no evidence of a fight, no cuts, and no bloodstains. The preliminary conclusion by law enforcement was that Bethany had taken her own life. The message she left was heavy with spiritual overtones. She penned that she felt cursed, seeing 0 escape routes. Specific lines exposed her guilt and a terrifying dread of everlasting damnation. However, the detectives were unsettled by the penmanship. It didn't look anything like her standard, clean, flowing cursive. The characters were jagged and trembling in contrast to her previous notes. Loved ones who viewed the page noted the phrasing and vibe felt completely alien to her usual way of writing. Experts rushed the document off to the lab for a complete graphological review. Crime scene investigators scoured the van for any trace evidence they could find, pulling prints and swabbing every inch of the cabin, including the wheel, buckles, and handles for DNA. Lab results came back clean, showing 0 genetic material belonging to anyone else. That absence of outside contact convinced detectives she was the only person in that car. Pathologists determined she died from lack of oxygen mixed with a massive dose of sleeping pills found in her blood. Authorities pointed out that mixing a suffocating bag with heavy sedatives clearly signaled a deliberate choice, not some tragic mishap. Shortly after, the lab verified that the penmanship on the suicide letter definitely belonged to Bethany. Specialists explained the shaky lettering as a byproduct of severe mental anguish and bodily fatigue when she drafted it. Any suspicion that someone else faked the message was formally taken off the table. Looking at the total sum of proof, the detective squad decided she ended her life of her own free will. Once the site was cleared, a truck hauled the van to police storage while the coroner moved her remains to the county facility. Officers broke the news to her parents and to the public. This looked like a sad case of someone suffering alone until they couldn't take it anymore. Then on November 9th, 2012, Micah Moore strolled into the station, flanked by 2 higher-ups from his church group. He approached the front desk, wanting to talk about Bethany, dropping a bombshell confession right there in the lobby. Staff alerted the investigation team instantly and hustled Moore back to a secure interrogation box. They assigned him a public defender and started rolling the tape on his official testimony. He started off shaky and nervous. His words were broken. The tension was palpable, and he kept begging for something to drink. He claimed that for a long stretch leading up to the tragedy, guys from their shared home had been dosing her with heavy antipsychotics on the sly. They allegedly slipped her the liquid meds, which knocked her out cold. While she was incapacitated, Moore insisted that multiple group members assaulted her. He mentioned they filmed the assaults on his tablet and that a few guys even penned poetry celebrating the abuse. Moore went on to say Tyler Deaton knew everything and actually called the whole thing a spiritual awakening. He explained that once she started therapy and might spill the beans, the clique got terrified of being found out. Allegedly, Tyler looked him in the eye and said it was necessary, tapping him as the only one capable of finishing the job. Moore took those words as a command to silence her permanently before she could rat them out to authorities. He laid out the timeline for police, stating he linked up with her at Longview Lake on the morning of October 30th. In his version of events, he drugged her with a drink and then suffocated her with a bag until the life left her body. Once she was gone, he claimed he rigged the car to look like a suicide by planting the pills in the goodbye letter. He also mentioned that Tyler had shared a vision days prior where he dreamt of smothering his own spouse. Moore viewed that story as a divine sign to proceed, driven by the group's terror of jail time and public shame. They struck first, convinced they were obeying orders and shielding their fraternity from ruin. Police drilled him for specifics on the timing, location, where he got the kill kit, and who else was in on the plot. He insisted he did the deed solo, but confessed that Tyler and the boys were fully aware of the plan. He dropped another lead, claiming the tablet with the incriminating footage was sitting back at their residence. With this new info, they alerted the district attorney immediately and put a hold on the memorial service. Authorities kept her remains for another exam and flipped the case file from suicide to potential murder. A judge signed off on a raid of the communal home and a seizure of all Moore's personal effects. The church officials who drove Moore in were grilled as witnesses regarding the timeline before he spilled his guts. That admission of guilt set off a massive firestorm in the press instantly. Within 24 hours, news crews from all over were splashing wild stories about cults, sex rings, and murder across the screen. Journalists swarmed the precinct and camped out on lawns across the city, badgering family and locals for a quote. Attention pivoted rapidly, moving beyond just the shocking admission to the bigger picture. Everyone started scrutinizing Tyler Deaton's power over the group and his ties to the famous prayer organization. The church clapped back fast, releasing a memo that flatly rejected any knowledge of weird rituals or secret sex within that circle. They cut Deaton loose from every program and permanently barred him from setting foot on their property again. The press release made it crystal clear that this group was a rogue entity operating with tactics that completely violated everything IHOP stood for. From that point on, the organization stuck to their guns, making sure everyone knew there was zero connection between them. All that anger didn't just stay online. Families mobilized immediately, with terrified parents racing straight to Kansas City to rescue their kids. For the next couple of days, the Grandview rentals were a revolving door of moving trucks as people packed up their lives in a hurry. Vehicles were constantly shuttling folks to the terminals or hitting the highway, hauling young adults back home either right away or after a quick chat with the cops. While everyone was scrambling to leave, detectives were busy grilling anyone they could get their hands on to piece together what happened. Police took meticulous notes on who lived where and when, logging exactly who had keys to which rooms and seizing every digital device in sight. On November 14th, 2012, the Jackson County prosecutor slapped Micah Moore with a first-degree murder charge, proving to the press that this wasn't just talk. Before the weekend rolled around, those two rental properties were basically ghost towns with almost no one left inside. A bunch of the members bailed with their parents, and the rest scrambled to find crash pads far away from Tyler's sphere of influence. Once they were back in the real world with their loved ones, the ex-members finally started to realize just how messed up the mind games had actually been. People were torn on how to react, with one side screaming for the book to be thrown at everyone who played a part in this mess. Then you had folks wondering if the big religious institutions should be on the hook for these fringe groups that go rogue right under their noses. When Micah Moore took back his confession later on, it forced the detectives to go back and comb through every single shred of evidence with a fine-tooth comb. The first red flag popped up when they realized Moore's description of where the body was found didn't match reality at all. He had told them specifically that she was sitting up in the front passenger seat. However, the crime scene log showed she was way back in the third row, a major error that made police wonder if he was just making it all up. Next, the detectives started digging into exactly where he was physically located on the day she died. School logs and debit card swipes proved he was sitting in a classroom and buying stuff exactly when the crime was supposed to be happening. That hard data made it impossible for him to be at Longview Lake, giving him an airtight alibi that the prosecution couldn't crack. Lab results poked another hole in his story too, showing her system was full of Tylenol PM but completely clean of any antipsychotics. So his whole narrative about drugging her or forcing pills down her throat that day turned out to be a total fabrication The coroner's office also cleared up the assault claims, finding absolutely zero signs of trauma or any physical evidence of abuse. Actually, the medical findings prove she had never been intimate with anyone, which completely destroyed his story about the ongoing assaults. Tech experts tore apart the devices they confiscated, only to find that the iPad in question had been wiped clean or never used. There wasn't a single clip, secret folder, or even a ghost of a deleted file to be found anywhere on the drive. Digital forensics proved the tablet was never used for what he claimed, and then the surveillance tapes from Walmart added another twist. Security cams caught Bethany buying those exact bottles of sleep aid with her own money, and the boxes were a perfect match for the ones at the scene. With all that evidence on the table, the detectives circled back to what they had suspected in the very beginning. It was a suicide, plain and simple, and Moore's admission was tossed out as a false confession with zero physical proof to back it up. By October 2014, the DA in Jackson County had no choice but to throw out the entire case against Micah Moore. After 2 years of digging, it became obvious he cracked under stress and told a story that didn't fit the reality of what happened. The official cause of death for Bethany Deaton was switched back to suicide on the books. Lawyers and shrinks alike pointed out that Moore looked less like a killer and more like just another casualty of the group's intense environment. This result crushed Bethy's parents, who couldn't believe the case was being shut down without Tyler Deaton facing any real consequences. As far as they were concerned, Tyler was the architect of the toxic world of manipulation that drove her to the edge. In their eyes, the blood was on his hands, regardless of whether the law could technically pin a crime on him or not. Tyler Deaton went on record swearing he had nothing to do with hurting her or pushing her towards suicide. He claimed he never ordered anyone to touch her, only admitting he dropped the ball and noticing how much pain she was really in. For the grieving family and the people who escaped his orbit, his statement was just a pathetic way to wiggle out of taking the blame. Once he was a free man again, Micah Moore packed his bags and headed back down to Texas. He ghosted everyone from that old life and did his best to stay completely off the radar.